Okay, we're ready for our bike ride here. Check you guys in a minute. Okay, so we survived that little downhill, and Miriam wants to get out. Miriam, how was that? You want to get out? Okay, we're here in the forest, and it's a fantastically beautiful day, and I'm just gonna get Miriam out here. As I had shared, what had happened was I had those two friendships, and things were not going really that well for me in those friendships, because as I had shared, I'd got into a lot of trouble, and it was really snowballing, stealing, lying, playing hooky. And so I had to make a choice. I had to make a choice as to whether or not I was going to get better friends or not. And in the end, what had happened was I made the choice to start playing sports, and specifically rugby. And so I will be sharing now here in the next bit about how, when I look back, of course, just at how good God was for me at that time, because once again, it was one of the kids that I was involved with, who was in the same grade as me and in the same rugby team. His dad, he was a coach, and he saw me, and he put a lot of faith in me as a player. And so I became friends with his son, and also with a couple of other kids in grade 3, and that's where the turning point came. And so in the next bit of chapter 4, I will be sharing more about that. Let me just share with you what I've written here about getting involved with the game of rugby. I started to scan the playground, and there were a lot of boys during the recess that played the game of rugby. And I never really considered playing the game of rugby up until that point. But I knew that if I could join the rugby crowd, then perhaps I would make a new friend or two. And so that was my choice. I didn't like the game that much at first, to be quite honest. It was an aggressive sport, it was physical, but it was a good game in the sense that kids got respect for you if you started getting stuck in and you showed guts and you didn't show a lot of fear. So that was something that I picked up very quickly there. And I then started to enjoy the game. The more I started getting recognition for maybe here and there catching the ball pretty well, and a good kick and a good pass and a good break, it built up my self-esteem, and I enjoyed that, and it made a huge difference in my life. So I liked the way that it made me feel to have other boys pat me on the back after I made a good tackle or a good run with the ball, and I decided to try out for the under 9 rugby team. Now the coaches in 1992 were Mr. Barnard and one of the other boys on the team's father, and his name was Mitch Schwan. What a great guy. Initially they put me on 8th man position, but if you know me and you know how I'm built, I'm skinny, not super strong, not super fast. I was not an 8th man. And so they moved me off to the wing very quickly. And on the wing, it was quite safe because I didn't get the ball that much, and I could make a decent tackle there at the end of the line. And so that is where they placed me. But what I wanted to share here is how providential this was, because once again, it was one of the other kids in my rugby team's father, this was Mitch, who noticed me, and he started encouraging me, even though he had the wrong name to start off with. He called me Renier instead of Rudy. But it was great. You know, at least he took an interest in me, and he saw that I had some potential on the rugby team. And this had an influence in how his son also looked at me and some of his other friends. And so I became friends with these 3 guys. It was Werner Schwan, Niels de Tooy, and there was another guy, Henu Wagenaar. And these guys will know what I'm talking about. But these were the early days of our rugby years. And so grade 3 in the end turned out to be a pretty good school year. You know, as I then started doing well in class, I was doing well academically. I was one of the top achievers in the class. I had shaken off this whole thing that had happened with Andre Mostert and the other guy, Rudy. And so I then started becoming a little bit more popular amongst other kids by playing the sport of rugby. But at home, the situation hadn't changed much. You know, my dad wasn't able to find work. He had then tried to make a plan to reach out to some old friends of his that were living in the town of Cullinan, that's also just outside of Pretoria. And there was apparently an opportunity for my dad there to start working in the butchery that these people owned. And so Vanner and me, you know, we were just starting to settle back in Brakpan and things were looking up. And then all of a sudden, this news again, that halfway through 1992, we hear that we have to move again. And this was devastating. You know, I was just starting to make good friends. And so what had happened was we had to make the move to Cullinan, just outside of Pretoria again. But we were excited because it was similar to Hammanskraal. It was in the Bushveld, so there were some promising prospects of this move. By the end of the school term, the end of June, we then had to make this move, and Dad found this old mining house, that was vacant, and we were able to rent it. I'm not sure how Dad paid for it initially, but I'm sure he made some sort of deal with the landlord, as he usually was able to. But the move was not great. It was winter, it was cold and depressing, and Cullinan was not the same type of town as Hammanskraal. Even though it was in the Bushveld, it hardly represented or presented us with a paradise of Hammanskraal. Transitioning into another new school again was very hard for both Vander and me. Vander had now gone from having been elected as the head boy at the end of 1991 to at least being a prefect at President Brandt Primary School to now halfway in 1992. He was just one of the students in the school. My morale was also quite low, as all of my friendships, were now lost, and once again, I'm in this new school, a new environment. Dad started working at the butchery, and for the first 2 months, I believe, it kind of went well, but then things started going a little bit pear-shaped from there. Apparently, there was a disagreement between our father and the owners of the butchery, and in the end, what had happened was that they, for some kind of reason, stopped paying my father what they had promised him. Retrospectively, we're not sure how much truth there was in this story that our father was telling us. Because what had happened, and this is only what we realized years afterwards, is that was most probably a situation when my father was bipolar. And so this opportunity of Cullinan was another manic state of his bipolar depression. And together with that, this had a tremendous influence on my mother's schizophrenic symptoms. And she became quite ill to the extent that she had to be readmitted to Tara Mental Hospital and receive treatment for that all over again. And so what this looked like is that this left Vander and me with Dad at home. Money was really scarce in this time, and Dad was drinking, and our family life was in bad shape. We didn't have enough money to pay the electricity for about, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks. It could have been more, I'm not sure. And so we were in the middle of winter and trying to get through this difficult time, but we didn't have even electrical power in our house. A very inspirational thing that happened during this time was I can just remember how Vander was very focused and very persistent, and he would do his homework just under the candlelight. That is what he would do, and I still have this image in my mind of how we did that, and that really inspired me as a little brother. And during this time in Cullinan, I remember how we were basically relying on Dad to bring scraps from the butchery that we would live off. These scraps were like the legs and the paws of pigs, and he would try and then from that extract as much meat as possible that he would try and make like a stew of together mixed with cabbage, and it was terrible. I also remember having made friends with our neighbor's boy, and Vander and I would start hanging out there and eat dinners with them because we didn't have sufficient food at times. And one time I remember how hungry we were with no food, and Vander and I started searching the house for money that my mother might have stashed somewhere, and that is what she did sometimes. She would just hide money so that my dad wouldn't get it. And then this one day we discovered it. It's almost like a hidden treasure, and we found a 10 rand note. And my dad was overjoyed, and what had happened that evening was we went to the store, we bought a fresh white bread and some canned fish, pilchard sardine fish, and I think we bought a packet of cigarettes for my dad. We were able to buy that with 10 rand. Nowadays you won't buy anything of that extent with a 10 rand, but it was the best meal, I promise you, we had in such a long time, and that evening our tummies were full. But the issue was that things couldn't carry on in that way for too long, and the stress had gotten to my dad as well. And so eventually what had happened in 1992 was my father also had a nervous breakdown, and he was ill again, and so it was the same situation as it was in 1989, when my dad had his bipolar or manic state. So we were starting to see a pattern, but at this stage we didn't really recognize the pattern. It was only retrospectively that we were able to say, hey, this is actually what was going on. And what had happened at that stage was my father was then once again admitted into the same hospital as my mother, and the two of them were in the psychiatric hospital. And for that brief period of time, I'm not entirely sure how long it was, maybe it was for a week or two, Van and me had to live with some of our neighbors, and then at one stage I went to go live with Karen, I think for a week, and attended the school where she was teaching at that stage, and I was just in the class with her. And then it was the same with Vander. He lived with Martin, and he was at his school, and so that is how our siblings helped us in that regard. Now I'm going to conclude here this chapter by just reading to you this. And this time that we were out of Cullinan Primary School and attended school with Karen and Martin, it was just a temporary solution to a major problem. Reflecting back on this time, I'm surprised that none of our neighbors had really phoned the social services, as we could easily have been taken away from our parents. But few people knew what was happening in our house. Our family was very good at keeping our issues a secret and confidential, with no one really suspecting that we were living in such conditions. We called it the Botha pride, and we would rather die than anyone find out what our struggles were. And so after Mom and Dad had managed to recover in Tara Psychiatric Hospital, we were back at home again. Dad had made the decision that we would not stay in Cullinan the next year, and so the plan was that we would finish school and then move back to Brakpan in December of 1992. Dad didn't have work, and so we didn't know where to go to, except to stay with my dad's oldest brother, Uncle David, and his wife, Aunt Stella. This once again was not ideal and kind of embarrassing to our Botha pride, but my parents didn't have any choice. By that time, Karen and Martin had come up with a plan to help us. They had found a little apartment in town that we would rent, and they would help pay the rent. And then that was how 1992 ended. And so that is just I tried to summarize and not to read too much this time, but that is basically how 1992 ended for me. And I hope that you enjoyed that, reflecting on the importance of choosing good friends. And I just want to encourage you to share this with someone who you know might benefit from just hearing the story. And in the end, I want to say that it's only retrospectively, years after, that I look back at it again and just see God's faithfulness and just His grace in our lives and how good He was for me. And so I just want to give Him all the glory and share this with you guys.